I wanted to talk to you all about something in regards to the civil rights movement that is deeply important for what's happening today. Okay. Now, there are some critiques we could have of Martin Luther King. Okay. And I know that there's like a lot of lefties have some issues, especially, well, yeah, a lot of lefties have some issues with Martin Luther King. There's also a divide, a pretty big divide still today also in the black community between people who are really more supportive of Malcolm X's tactics versus Martin Luther King's tactics in achieving gains for black Americans, etc. It should also be noted that there's a lot of propaganda that goes into Martin Luther King because of how the history of Martin Luther King is taught and because of the desire of capital to maintain capitalism. A lot of the stuff that Martin Luther King believed in is hidden. It isn't talked about in schools. For example, I don't know if you all know, but Martin Luther King was basically a socialist. Okay, he was a socialist. He thought that with the redistribution of wealth was necessary and things like that. You almost never hear about that part of him, though. Okay, almost never. As a matter of fact, I bet that there'll be all these things going on today for Martin Luther King Day, and I bet very few people will ever any of these official things celebrating him will even touch on the fact that he was for major economic reform and not just racial stuff. Okay. Because that is the that's the stuff we don't talk about when it comes to Martin Luther King. All right. He was very radical. Yeah, exactly, Big Braden. He was very radical economically, but people don't talk about that. And this is where I'm always saying, folks, that a lot of times racial issues are kind of used as a distraction. That's not to say they don't exist. They absolutely do exist, but it is not as hard for, okay. Yeah, there you go, woke gay Marxists. Thank you, woke gay Marxists. Yeah, that it is not uh there. Let me give you an example here. There are elites who are black. All right. So movements for racial justice, a lot of times elites will support those movements because some of those elites are black. Now, at this time, there weren't really any of those, but my point is, but as soon as you get into economic movements for change, there's a lot more pushback. Okay. Regardless, this, the racial issues are a big issue. If you see what I mean. Okay. And racism is a tool of oppression. It also reproduces capitalist oppression. Racism would exist with or without capitalism. It is just a tool of oppression. I don't know what else to tell you. Okay, and it's just as important as talking about uh, uh, and other forms of oppression. Okay. Fox emblem, absolutely. It is. That's one of the issues with Marxism, folks, that I've pointed out before, is that it is somewhat class reductionist. It ignores other forms of oppression with and doesn't and tends to forget that there are in fact non-capitalism, non-class forms of oppression. Racial oppression is one of those forms. Okay, so what Martin Luther King did was great, but there are some critiques of him. But I wanted to talk about. Um, ooh, thank you. I wanted to talk with you all about the the civil rights movement briefly because okay, let me explain here. Okay, yeah, okay, so let's talk, shall we? When we talk about the civil rights movement, what do we all think about? Just throw out some terms, okay? Even the non-Americans probably know something about the American civil rights movement, okay? What do we think about? What comes to mind when you hear civil rights movement, the American civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King? What do you think about? Someone throw out some words, okay? Throw out some words here, okay? Anyone have a? What do we think? Okay, uh, Black Panthers. Oh, woke gay Marxist. That's because you're a woke gay Marxist. Well done. Okay. Sit-ins. Thank you, Drusilla. Sit-ins. Okay. So sit-ins, folks, where rights activists went into restaurants that were segregated, where black people were not allowed and only white people were allowed, and they would sit down. They would sit down. I can even show you an image. Okay. They would sit down and do things like this. Okay. Sit-in. There's a famous image of a sit-in, a really famous image, if I can find the exact one here, okay, of some desegregationist civil rights activists sitting down in a whites only diner, and the white you see them sitting here, and the white racist people in there who were trying to get them to leave started pouring different liquids on them and harassing them, and they sat there stoically while being harassed, while they were breaking the segregation rules. Okay, so that's an example of a sit-in. What else? We also heard sanitation workers, absolutely, and absolutely going on strike, resisting things like that. Okay, peaceful protests, correct. Protesters getting hosed down for nothing. That is an image I wanted to show you. Okay, okay. So yeah, I can show you actually, I have that image in my presentation. You have protesters here, and we'll talk about this in a second, where the police were brutal, absolutely brutal, towards some of these protesters doing things like this. These are some civil rights protesters, black civil rights protesters being blasted with a fire hose. And guys, fire hoses are very powerful. They will tear the skin off your body, literally. They will tear the skin off your body and bruise your body and do internal bleeding. And these were police spraying peaceful black protesters trying to get their rights recognized. Okay. So these are the kind of things we think about. Okay. Yes, National Guard escorting black students to class, okay, because so let me explain for those who don't know, all right? Segregation was prominent throughout the South. So basically, there were laws on the book that prevented white people and black people from occupying the same spaces together, public spaces, private spaces. Like businesses would be whites only. They would only let white people in. Black people weren't allowed in. The buses were segregated, where black people had to sit at the back of buses, white people at the front of buses. You had also, even though black people were supposed to have the right to vote, the southern states, and most of this stuff happened in the South. There were some in the North too. The southern states had laws that made it almost impossible for black people to register to vote, and they would change the rules. So, like if a black person went in to register to vote, they had laws that were things like, they have to, these black people registering to vote have to answer certain civics questions, and if they get those questions wrong, they can't register to vote. So these black folks would go into a voter registration office to sign up to vote, and the white register would ask them impossible questions that it was almost impossible to answer, such as name every single judge in the state of Mississippi, and then they would disqualify them from voting. They had all these unofficial ways of preventing black people from being able to vote, from to segregate them, keep them separate from the white population. There were also a number of Ku Klux Klan organizations doing literal terrorism against black folks, including one famous incident where a black church was bombed by the Ku Klux Klan, killing several young girls, literally. So these movements were the civil rights movement was an effort to dismantle these systems, to dismantle the disruption of voting rights, dismantle segregation, and racial oppression in the South. Okay, I am kind of oversimplifying. All right, and the idea here it was led by a number of different groups. Okay, Martin Luther King became kind of the figurehead, and I want to talk. It ended up being pretty successful in the goals it set out to achieve. We can also debate how it was incomplete. It was incomplete. Obviously, racial oppression still occurs on a massive scale today, but it did fix a few things somewhat. Okay, but I want to talk about how it succeeded. We're not going to get so much into the we're not going to get so much into the morality of it or the implications of it for racial struggle, okay? I want to talk about strategy and tactics in regards to peaceful resistance and revolution. Okay, so let me explain. Okay. Oh my god, really real Zarp, fascinating. Your parents went through this garbage. Amazing. Okay. So let's talk about this real fast because I took a very fascinating class when I was in college called the History of War. All right. So, what the hell does the history of war have to do with the civil rights movement? Well, I had a brilliant professor, and I got to tell you, you're going to be shocked when I tell you this. He was a conservative, and yet he was a very good professor. He didn't let the conservatism bias him, and he made a very compelling argument, I felt, that the civil rights movement was war, and it was Martin Luther King engaged in brilliant tactics war tactics that ended up winning this war, and there were battles. Now, the war was fought with nonviolent means, but it was essentially a war, a war of resistance. And he set the idea of the civil rights movement up as a series of battles. Some were won, some were lost, and ultimately with the ultimate victory being achieved. So that led to discussions in the class of what battles were won and why were they won? How can you use nonviolence to win a war, okay, and achieve your strategic goals? And how can nonviolence be defeated by the other side? Okay? So let's talk about this. So first of all, these activists who went into the South and who were living in the South also in order to fight back and do all these nonviolent civil disobedience things, they trained a lot. Okay. They practiced a lot. They knew that they were likely going to be met with violence from local sheriff's departments from the state, and they trained for it. Here we have an image on the left of civil rights activists who in Ohio actually who are planning to go into the South to be civilly disobedient and do sit-ins and march and things like that, practicing. They are practicing for what might happen to them if the police try to abuse them and things like that. And you can see here they are uh you can see here that they are laying on the ground. They're practicing holding on to each other and protecting themselves from being beaten by the police, while other activists are pretending to be the police. Okay. And they would practice and practice and practice. What do you do when the police attack you? What do you do with this? What do you do with that? They were highly organized and they had experience and they practiced. That image I showed you of these people, look how calm they are while they're being harassed, okay, while they're having liquids poured on them, while they're being yelled, racial slurs are being yelled at the woman at the end here, while even the white folks are being slurred and yelled at. They're very calm and relaxed, okay? They practiced. They practiced being mindful, being almost achieving a meditative state where you stay calm, and cool and collected in the face of being abused. All right. And by the way, they took these tactics from Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi of India. Okay, Mohandas. All right. So they practiced and they were organized. What was the point of this? All right. Hiyori, there were non-blacks, by the way, murdered. All right, for supporting black people. There were people killed in this movement, and I want to point out, folks, that some of these folks knew that they might die. So you have a bunch of people. Yeah, Jonas, exactly. Jonas, you're stealing my thunder in a good way. Okay. They practiced for it. They were organized. They knew that there were going to be pictures taken. Okay. They knew that there were going to be pictures taken of what was happening, and they purposely made sure to let journalists know to be there when they did these things. This was their tactic. Because the idea here is that if you let other Americans see black and white Americans being abused by Southern racists, that will cause more empathy. That will cause people to get more radicalized, and it'll pressure the president and Congress to do something about it. So that it was all part of their strategy. You train, you practice, you make sure there's journalists there, and then you go in and you have to be prepared that for violence to be done to you. All right, you understand? All right. So let me go on. So let's talk about two battles that occurred. All right. Two battles. First, we're going to talk about a battle that was a defeat. All right. Because, folks, I've said this before. At this time period, there was no social media. So the way that Martin Luther King and a lot of these leaders of this movement, there were many more than just Martin Luther King. I thought of this was almost like we need to magnify what we're doing through the media. And if we can get the police to react to us in a violent and horrible way and to dehumanize us on camera, that's going to cause people to feel empathy, and that's going to cause greater and greater pushback against what's happening in the South. All right. especially if the media captures images of it happening. This was a purposeful strategy, and it was brilliant. Now, so let's go on here. Let's talk about the Albany movement, okay? So there you go, Macy. But like martyrdom, yes. But Macy, violence would also cause martyrdom. They kind of viewed it as a battle, and yeah, some of them might die. But if the strategy works, just like if you'd fight violently, some of you might die, but you need to achieve the end. Okay. So let's see here, right? The goals of this movement. Okay. Yeah. There you go, Fox Emblem. Okay. The goals of the Albany movement was to desegregate public facilities. So allow parks, libraries, restrooms, and government buildings to be integrated so blacks and whites could use them. Ending segregation on public transportation. All right. Securing rights for African Americans to vote. Achieving equal treatment under the law for blacks. And by the way, folks, I know I keep saying blacks. I'm not a big fan of that term. I'm just saying it so that I don't have to constantly say black Americans, okay? Because it adds more syllables. I know I'm lazy, okay? Black Americans, all right? Achieving segregation, challenging segregation citywide rather than targeting a single institution. So, Albany, their plan in Albany was to target all these things at once in a massive campaign of desegregation and destruction of removing oppression. All right. And the result was this, okay? Images like this came out of Albany. Images, remember the goal here. The goal here is to get a massive backlash that you then get on camera to cause radicalization and to cause empathy. Here are some two images from Albany. I can guarantee you, if you get on your computer right now and you look up images of the Albany movement, you're not going to see many interesting images. You're going to see these kind of images, like some people peacefully protesting in the streets. Okay. Some people peacefully, doing, peacefully protesting in the streets. I'm sorry. What are you guys talking about? Forgive me. Yes. Oh, you're right, guys. Okay. I see some talk about Rosa Parks. I am not talking about details here, but yes, there was some dark stuff about there was some very dark stuff about the civil rights movement. I don't want to say very dark, but there were certain people left out of it and or ignored because they weren't considered tactically a good idea. For example, Rosa Parks was not the first person to be kicked off of a bus. All right. But the woman who did it before her was not viewed by civil rights activists as someone who could generate as much sympathy. So they did not emphasize her as being like they emphasized Rosa Parks. These were all tactical decisions. I could even complain, folks, I could even complain about how Martin Luther King's speechwriter was not Bertrand Russell. What is his name? Oh my God, I'm having a mind blank. I should know his name. Martin Luther King. Bayard Rustin. I can't believe I forgot about that. Bayard Rustin. Yeah, it's insane. The real Zarp. That's insane that your mother went through that. Welcome, real Zarp. Real Zarp said, "I remember my mom telling me how they had to go into the back of the dentist office and then wait all day until almost closing when all the white people were seen just to be examined." Insane. Okay. Um, yep, bogus. It was. Rosa Park was planned. It was a planned action. Okay, all these actions are made. Are most of them are planned. Okay, I want to point that out. Rosa Parks was not spontaneous. But doesn't that show the brilliance of this movement? They thought these things out. This was not like spontaneous actions. They planned out these actions and they worked, did they not? Okay. So I know that might make it seem like the civil rights movement wasn't as uh um like that it wasn't, I don't know, as honest, but it was a very successful campaign. It shows how brilliant these people were, okay? Anyway, so Bayard Rustin, by the way, was MLK's speechwriter. He was a communist and he was a gay man. He was probably one of the most charismatic people in this whole movement, but he was kept out of the limelight because he was gay and a communist. And they did not. A lot of the civil rights leaders were religious, Christian religious, and they thought it would be bad for their image to have a gay man as the public face of their movement. So he was kept in the background and often doesn't get the credit he deserves. We can talk about a lot of these things that are problematic. Okay. Yeah, there were a lot of Muslims too. Okay. So we can talk a lot about these things, but regardless, let's talk about that here in a second. Yeah. There you go. There you go. A dirt bike juice, and she deserves credit as well. So let's go back to this, okay? So these are the images that came out of the Albany campaign. This, this image on the right, seeing all these black protesters and some white protesters kneeling right before they get arrested. I mean, okay, it's not really. Yeah, Rustin was MLK's best friend, and he was a gay communist, and he never gets talked about. It's very sad. But again, I will say I'm not necessarily judging this movement. It worked for what it was trying to do at the time, at least in some ways. Still a lot of oppression going on. All right. Okay. So here we have an image here of some black protesters. Now, remember what I said? The goal of this movement was to get a bunch of pictures that showed protesters and stuff getting massively abused. Does it look like it succeeded? Does it look like it succeeded from these images? Are these like Do you think these images like this would really radicalize people? Okay. Do we think images like this would really radicalize people or make people suddenly feel a lot more sympathy for black people? Things like these two images? Okay. What do we think? Anyone have an idea? Yeah, you're right, Earl, which is good. I'm glad. Welcome, Earl. Yes, there was a movie made about Rustin produced by the Obamas. Absolutely. Nah, no, Loiso. It didn't. It didn't work. It didn't work. Okay. Why didn't it work? Why didn't the police react to this the way that these civil rights workers wanted to in the Albany movement? Okay. Because of the sheriff who was in charge of Albany. His name was Laurie Pritchett. And if any civil rights activists out there or people who know about civil rights movement, he's one of the villains of these stories. But I'm not complimenting him. He was smart when it came to strategy. All right. He was not a good guy, but smart when it came to strategy. He did this on purpose. So the Albany police chief, Laurie Pritchett, carefully studied the civil rights movement strategy and developed a counter strategy that he hoped could subvert it. All right. And so in Albany, he used mass arrest, but he avoided violent incidents and he made sure he avoided having any violent incidents, and he definitely made sure that if there were violent incidents, that there were no cameras around to catch them. He also advocated for the use of nonviolent policing in response to nonviolent protest, and it worked. Okay, it worked. Unfortunately, he because without the reaction that the nonviolent protesters wanted, they couldn't get any images that would radicalize people. The media got tired of the movement and started leaving Albany and all that. And also, one of the strategies, by the way, of the civil rights protesters was to all get arrested. So, and then you would then fill up the jails and the jails would start overflowing because they would refuse to post bail. Laurie Pritchett understood this would happen, so he started dispersing arrested protesters to jails all around the state so that they would not be overflowing, and he planned all of this in advance. Okay? Not a good guy, but strategically he understood how that movement worked. All right? And the result was that they did not accomplish what they wanted in Albany. Albany did not end up getting desegregated. None of it was caught on camera, or very little of it was caught on camera. The nonviolent resistance didn't really amount to anything, and black folks continued to be oppressed in Albany. So, if I were to classify this would be a tactical defeat for the movement. This is one of those battles where the civil rights movement was defeated, okay? Tactically. The strategy is still there, but this was a battle that was a defeat, okay? Because the sheriff was not the kind of sheriff that you would want to achieve this strategy. Does that make sense? Okay. So what I'm saying, folks, is if we try nonviolent protest and stuff today, I'm sorry to say this, but what do we need? We need people to be organized. We need them to be willing to be violently attacked. We need them to be willing to make sacrifices. and we need to catch it on camera. We also need to make sure that the response that is gonna be given to them, that they're gonna get the response that we want, all right? Let me go on to another battle, all right? The Birmingham campaign. So here was another battle of the civil rights movement. I know, really, Jonas, it is, okay? Uh, let's talk about the Birmingham campaign. One of the positive things about the Albany campaign is that the civil rights leaders, MLK, SNCC, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and things like that, learned a lot of lessons from it. They realized their mistakes pretty quickly afterwards, and they adapted their strategy. You got to be able to adapt your strategy, and you can't give up if your strategy initially fails. You may lose a battle, but that doesn't mean you've lost the war, right? So in their next campaign, they planned very carefully. They purposely chose Birmingham, Alabama, because they knew that the sheriff there was a monster, was a sheriff that had promoted violence, had done extreme violence towards the black community, was a raging racist and segregationist. They understood that any sort of movement to liberate the black community there would be met with massively violent resistance from the state. Okay, they made sure of this. They purposely chose their battleground. They chose the battleground of Birmingham, knowing the response they would likely get. And they learned basically from accidentally having that other sheriff in charge of the other battleground. So the goal of the Birmingham campaign was as follows: end racial segregation in Birmingham, desegregate businesses. Uh, h- um, okay, there you go, Loisa. Okay, uh, secure fair hiring practices for black workers in stores and businesses, desegregate public housing facilities, force negotiation for these things by creating economic pressure, and other things like that. Now, another problem, by the way, with Albany is that they had too many goals. You need more focused goals. Albany, as I said, they tried to do everything at once. They had much more focused goals in Birmingham. Okay. They're like, okay, we need to narrow the goals, make it more focused, and make sure we're fighting in the correct battleground for we will be successful. Okay. And their main goal here was just to to draw attention to the brutality of segregation. So, this is how it started. In 1963, Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference joined with Birmingham, Alabama's existing local movement in a massive direct action campaign to attack the city's segregation system by putting pressure on Birmingham's merchants during the Easter season. The big thing they decided to do was to strangle the economics of the city. And that is a much better strategy than sort of going after a bunch of things at once, all right? During the biggest shopping season of the year. So they had a better, more focused strategy of targeting the economics of the city to hurt more businesses and things like that, okay? And on the 3rd of April, this desegregation campaign was launched with a series of mass meetings, direct actions, okay? Excuse me, direct actions, lunch counter sit-ins, marches on City Hall, and a boycott of downtown merchants. This was the response. All right. The sheriff in charge, or the safety guy in charge of Birmingham, was a monster by the name of Eugene Bull Connor. He was nicknamed Bull because he was a bull. He just uh he was a brutal guy. He was well known to be a monster, okay? Massive racist POS, and basically a dumb thug who thought who only response to any kind of disobedience by black people was violence. And this was well known by the civil rights activists when they chose Birmingham as their next battleground. His response was immediate and vicious to this. Okay, uh, he famously unleashed almost immediately on these protesters police dogs to bite them. Okay, to tear them up. I'm not exaggerating. He had the fire department come out with high pressure fire hoses to blast the protesters in the head, face, and body, which, by the way, can tear the skin off your body and cause internal bleeding because these are very powerful. All right. Including children, by the way, because the civil rights protesters brought children to their protests. And if that sounds immoral, I understand why you think that, but remember what their goals are. Why do you think that they may have brought younger people to the protests? Okay, you can think about that. Um, and they actually even called it the 1963 Children's Crusade, and they had a lot of children there. And they made sure that when Bull Connor unleashed the full fury of the police on these protesters, that there were hundreds of journalists around to capture it on camera. And the result was the production of images like this. So here's one of my favorite images from the civil rights movement. Oh, forgive me. I went way too far out for that to work. Okay, we see this. That is an image of a horse, or not a horse, I'm like, a horse, a dog tearing at a peaceful black protester. All right. Okay. This is a very famous image. Bye bye, Mithril. Very famous image of a police dog attacking a black protester. Okay. Uh, right. Here's another image here. These are firemen literally firing a high power fire hose at peaceful black protesters. It's so powerful, it literally knocks them off their feet and throws them to the ground. All right. Okay. Here we have this one is not from the Birmingham campaign, but it's illustrative of the effect they were hoping to have. There were people coming from the north on what were called freedom buses with black and white protesters on them, and they would go around public transportation segregated towns to show that, like, look, black and white people can be on the same bus, and it's not an issue. And one of these buses got firebombed and caught on fire, and the Ku Klux Klan would sometimes wait for these buses to arrive and then beat people up as they came out of them. So that was captured on camera. Here's another famous image of a woman, a man, and two men standing up against a wall as they're being blasted by a high power fire hose. You will notice if you see their faces that they're calm. They are taking the beating with stoicism because they practice this, right? That is extremely brave and extreme takes a lot of mental discipline to not fight back. And they stood there and took it and made sure that it was caught on camera. All right. So another picture here, Martin Luther King ended up being arrested. And this photo was released of him after he was arrested, and that became famous. All right. The result of the Birmingham campaign was that Birmingham was desegregated. Okay, because people all over the country started seeing all these images, and suddenly there was a ton. Now I'm slightly oversimplifying here, but people all over the country started seeing these images and started thinking, okay, what are you doing? The South, you're abusing all these people brutally, and they're standing there peacefully. And it created empathy, and there was suddenly a ton of pressure on LBJ. I'm sorry, on John F. Kennedy uh, and Congress to do something about it. And there were also fear. There were more people becoming radicalized, and the state got more and more afraid of rebellion. Okay. The northern states started getting upset because they were like, well, crap, the southern states are going to ruin this situation for all of us because we're going to have a violent revolt if they keep doing things that are hurting our government too. You see what I mean? So this Birmingham movement resulted in this was a major tactical victory. The Birmingham movement was like the Gettysburg of the civil rights movement, and it was a strategic victory because guess what happened right after this? They had this one massive victory, and right after this, JFK pushed through Congress the Civil Rights Act. Now it wasn't uh, put into law because a bunch of Southern senators were preventing it from being put into law. It ended up being put into law under LBJ, but Birmingham got desegregated. Congress started pushing through legislation to protect, to end segregation, make sure it was ended, and make sure that the federal government could enforce voting rights laws in the South and things like that. And this battle essentially allowed the civil rights movement to accomplish a lot of its goals because it worked strategically. All right. Do we understand? Okay. Now, I am again slightly exaggerating because there was another movement called the Selma March, which sort of after LBJ was became president after JFK was assassinated. That's when it finally got put into law, and there were other movements too that helped with this. But uh, you see here how the civil rights movement was purposeful, it was organized, it thought tactically, and it learned from its mistakes. And it had a very clever strategy for achieving its gains. And there was a combination of luck because you had a really bad sheriff that they knew that they could get a react. Actually, that wasn't luck. They did that on purpose. They knew it was a bad sheriff. Okay, so here, oh, don't get me wrong, Hayori. LBJ is a monster, but yes, he did. He also had to be pressured a ton to even enact this law. Okay, but regardless, okay. So my question for all of you is, now that we've learned about this, I have said before that, it's a very good idea to get the things that are being done to people like by ICE and stuff on camera because and now let me put my face up. Ooh, where's my face? All right. So, let's talk for a second, folks. How can we apply this to modern day? Now, I know that this was nonviolent resistance, all right? And many of us are think we might be done with nonviolent resistance, but is there any lesson we can learn from the tactics of the civil rights movement in regards to how to achieve change today? And how might it be different today? Is it different today? I just want to see what people think about this. I have long maintained that unfortunately, we almost want there to be escalation on the side of the police. I got to tell you, right? Because if the police are too violent, yeah, a lot of other tactics are even more right, Jonas. We also have social media, which could spread things faster. At the same time, we also have fake social media out there and shit like that, and people are so brainwashed they might not even believe it if they see it. There you go, Sir Bartholomew. Uh, train, train, train. Prepare for what you're trying to do. Have a clear goal. Plan, plan, plan. Be strategic about it. If you're going to be protesting in a city, choose a city where you expect that the police are not going to be too nice to you. And unfortunately, that requires bravery. That requires you to be willing to accept that violence might be done to you and you might be arrested. Okay. Yes. Now, Loiso. And there's other things I was going to talk about, Loy. So I have thoughts on strategic nonviolence, but the more important point for me is that without Malcolm X, Panthers, all this yet discussed wouldn't achieve a thing. Correct. So you have to understand, folks, that as I said, there was fear also in the country about violent resistance and civil war breaking out. So the nonviolent aspects of the civil rights unit was of movement was shadowed, or I should say, had a compliment in the Black Panthers, and Malcolm X, who were willing to use violence. So, for a lot of white people and government agents in the country, you had 2 examples of what might end up happening. You had people, Black resistors advocating saying that if we don't get what we want, we're gonna start using violence. And you have the peaceful, uh Black civil rights activists saying, "Give us what we're going to use peaceful tactics as long as we can, and you better give us what we want," which led a lot of white racists and things like that to be like, "We would much rather go." We're going to end up in civil war, and more people are going to join the Black Panthers and are going to join Malcolm X's movement unless we give in to Martin Luther King. So it was more complicated than just me saying it was the nonviolent part. Okay, but I'm mainly here talking about the tactics of the nonviolent aspect of it because we could also talk about how the threat of violence worked really well also. Okay. All right. So we do like the threat of violence from Black Panthers and Malcolm X was also a pressure point. Yeah. I know, Macy. And it's just something I want you all to think about. Okay. Uh, there you go. Harder to dehumanize children, Doug. All right. Start by not voting Earl B. Start by not voting for politicians who are not sympathetic to your goals, i.e., removing a qualified immunity by constantly lobbying to make those objectives part of their manifesto. See here, removing qualified immunity and constant lobbying to make those objectives. There you go, Earl. Okay, I think I understand what you mean. Okay, yeah, we could also learn that you need to attack their pockets because remember, this movement partially succeeded in Montgomery in Birmingham because they went after businesses. Exactly, paleontology dog. That's something I'm worried about, paleontology dog, is even if we were to capture stuff on camera to try and radicalize the country, it seems to me that a lot of people would just be like, "Oh, that's AI," or, they won't believe it anyway. So it's an interesting thing how the civil rights movement was able to use the media at the same time. Yeah, okay, that's true. All right. So it's just something to think about. It's just a very interesting approach to talking about this, right? Now, for those out there I'm more along the lines of Malcolm X and my ideas and in terms of my support and stuff. I will say this though, uh, Malcolm X would not have been able to win a battle. I'm not trying to be an asshole when I say that. It's just a matter of numbers. Like this notion that the benefit of Malcolm X was that Malcolm X was able to put fear in the hearts of politicians and stuff. Okay, not that Malcolm X and his movement would have necessarily succeeded if they did do a violent rebellion. They would have had to have a lot more support. Okay, um, and yeah, but I do think the pressure of all that was very helpful in a lot of ways. And that's why I kind of side with him. I'm kind of side with the stick part of this. And we can debate this. Yeah, Fred Hampton and Huey Newton, which were killed. And it kind of goes to show you who is more threatened by the state. Like, well, they're all a threat to the state. They all end up getting assassinated, but okay. Okay, and if you aim to affect real change, Democrats in power are as much as an enemy as the Yep. There you go, Loisa. Okay, yeah. So it's just interesting tactically to think about the civil rights movement and what they achieved with the strategy and tactics they used, with the understanding that there was also fear on the other side of what would happen if they didn't do that. Uh, okay, so yeah, bogus. But see, exactly. No, I know that. A lot of white people were more sympathetic to Martin Luther King, partially because they were less afraid of him. All right. And does that mean that here's my thing, right? Like I regardless of the fact that that's true, it did work, however, to get a lot of people on board with the movement that may not have been on board with the movement if just Malcolm X had been part of the movement. You see what I mean? I so this is complicated. This is why I'm talking as a historian here, right? I do mainly support Malcolm X in this stuff, but and this is a very contentious debate that we can all have differing opinions on, but uh, n- yeah, I also do think that Martin Luther King gets kind of a bad rap by a lot of people, and that's not to say I think he's better. I don't, but his movement did succeed in accomplishing some things. Um, where Malcolm X was helpful, but was not able to accomplish those things, at least in the same time frame, if that makes sense. Okay. Uh, yeah, there you go, Sir Bartholomew. You're not going to win hearts and minds by going in gun blazing. And there are some historians who would theorize that if Malcolm X had done that or something like that, that would have just radicalized people more against black folks, right? Uh, but we can debate this. But I feel like a lot of sympathy for Malcolm X. But as a historian, I'm just saying uh, this is debatable. Okay. Um, let's see here. All right. If you aim to after what happened with Ice and Renee, I'm not even sure they'd accept the footage. Exactly, Jonas. This is why I wanted to get you guys thinking about this. I don't know if these tactics would work modern day. Okay. Yeah. So it's just something to think about. All right. All right, you guys. So, uh, okay, where are these people who say they want guns so they can fight against tyranny when you need them? Oh, of course, Earl B. But don't you know, Earl B. That only applies to white people, right? Well, uh, as soon as you get uh, black people who want to do that, suddenly the tune of the right wingers change. As a matter of fact, here's a fun note, folks. Do you know that? Do anyone know who when California implemented some gun regulations? I forget what year it was. I don't remember what year it was. Do we know who the do we know who the governor of California was when they started implementing these gun regulations? I'm just curious if you know Reagan. Absolutely, Ronald Reagan. Do you know why he started implementing those gun regulations? Because of the Black Panthers. White people started getting afraid of armed black people in the streets policing the police, so Ronald Reagan implemented gun regulations, to protect American citizens because they were afraid of black people with guns. It is dumb. All right? Okay? You see what I mean? So, like, yeah, Earl, absolutely, Earl, none of those gun rights people ever are standing up at all for black folks when they want guns. Um, right? Yeah, it was bogus. You're right. It was pretty violent. But again, they only started pushing for that when the Black Panthers started making an appearance in the streets. Okay. It's really a question of how to convince a hypocritical Twitter, MAGA brain captured horde. Yeah. So it's just something to think about, kind of something to add to your repertoire. All right. Add to your repertoire of how to think about resistance, the civil rights movement, the ideas of Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King. I think both were good also, but I will point out though, guys, another issue with Martin Luther King, if you want to talk about legacy, right, is that uh we are so in history, right? You have history and then you have memory. History is what happened in the past and what we say happened in the past. Memory is what people remember happening about the past or what people choose to remember about the past, okay? We tend to only talk about Martin Luther King in when it comes to civil rights justice. We do not tend to talk about him when it comes to economic justice. And one of the big struggles of the black community today is economic justice. It was back then and it is now. And because we have not fundamentally changed the capitalist structures of our society or solved the fundamental inequalities caused by racial oppression over hundreds of years, that has made it very hard to actually fix a lot of the racial inequality problems. But unfortunately, a lot of Americans think that those problems have been solved because of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. All right. Like ask right wingers, even ask some liberals, they'll be like, oh, finally, black people are equal. Right. Black people are equal now because of Martin Luther King. No, they're not. Okay. So that is like how this stuff has been sort of the memory has been distorted of this, right? By our society. So, okay. All right, you guys. Man, what guys, what's wrong? What's wrong? Wait. Exactly, Meowser. No, wait. Lloyd's so hilarious. Okay. All right, you guys. So there you go. There's our little thing today, just because it's Martin Luther King Day, talking about some of the tactics and strategies uses in regards to the civil rights movement. And again, you guys can take what you want from that. I'm not sure I have a strong opinion either way, but that's just one way to look at resistance, okay, is how they did it that way. All right. And, it's also kind of funny that there's a Martin Luther King Day. There's not a Malcolm X Day. I wonder why. Okay. All right, you guys. So let's see what we got here. By the way, folks, for those that are new to the channel, please become a member. You can become a member on YouTube for as little as 99 cents a month. Little as 99 cents a month, you can become a member on YouTube. Second of all, here, if you're over on Twitch, please you can subscribe there using Amazon Prime and send me some of Jeff Bezos's money for free. You won't have to pay anything, and you get to send me some of Jeff Bezos's money. All right. Next here, you can also just subscribe regularly. Then you won't have to see any more ads anymore.